We are in fact privileged to have Ambassador Anil Wadhwa with us this morning to enlighten our students and research scholars on India-Australia relation. And we are so happy to welcome you, sir, to the Department of Political Science and of University of Kerala. And I think that your long experience in the Ministry of External Affairs and also involvement in the bilateral and multilateral forums would enlighten our youngsters to know much about India-Australia relation, because it is one of the significant area in the India's bilateral interaction, especially in the context of the Quad and also the initiatives coming from the democratic countries in the Indian Ocean region. I think that without much delay, I request Ambassador Anil Wadhwa to deliver his special lecture on India-Australia relation. Over to you, sir.
Today's topic is a vast topic. India-Australia relations are quite extensive, and this relationship has involved a number of ups and downs. The expansion has been very rapid, and so I'm going to, in the next 40-45 minutes that you've very generously given me, try to hold your interest by starting, of course, with our relationship much before this century, and then I'll trace the history of this relationship through to the present times. And thereafter, we can, have a few questions and answers. I start, first of all, by talking about the historical relationship that India and Australia had. So we can go back to the European settlement, which happened in Australia in 1788. And at that time, there was a penal colony which was set up in New South Wales, which was controlled by the British East India Company through Kolkata. So it was something like the Kalapani, where all the people who were criminals were actually sent and banished to Australia at that point in time. But of course, the control had to be maintained on these people. So in 1792, we have, in only the fourth year of this infant penal colony, there was a supply ship called Guardian, which sank, and that left the inhabitants on this huge Australian island close to starvation. So it was actually Calcutta that the governor looked for help, and he dispatched a ship called Atlantic to bring back all the food and stores that it could carry. And the Atlantic returned on a winter's day the same year with a cargo of rice, of wheat, and lentils, which helped these inhabitants survive on the island. Australia's first shipments of coal were to Bengal in 1799 from Newcastle, which Newcastle is actually in Australia, not just in England, because most of these names, because it was a colony of the British, they were taken from Britain. And so you find many of those names repeated in Australia. For the next half century, Australia's most immediate and direct links were with India rather than London, because you had bureaucrats, you had merchants, you had chaplains, and their judges. They all moved between the two colonies. And by 1840, a ship was leaving Sydney for India roughly every 4 days. And so the merchants who were there in Calcutta grew very rich from supplying this new outpost. India was an important source of food and provisions for Australia. It was also a source of retired colonials, as they were called, bringing Anglo-Indian furniture and architectural styles and taste for spicy food to this island. So at the beginning of the 19th century, several British colonial families from India made a life for themselves in the new Australian colonies. Yet another trend that we notice is in the 19th and 20th centuries was the movement of Indian settlers from Mauritius, from Fiji, from South Africa, from British Guyana, and from the Caribbean to Australia. In the latter years of the 19th century, the labor demand in sugar plantations further incentivized the Indians also to migrate to Australia. So the first Sikhs arrived in the country somewhere in the late 1830s. And the Sikhs came from an agrarian background, so they fulfilled their tasks as farm laborers on cane fields and shepherds on sheep stations very well. Until the 1860s, Indians, and these were mostly Sikhs, worked as merchants, as industrialists, and businessmen in Australia. From the 1860s onwards, you had cameliers who were commonly called Ghans, Ghans. They were brought to Australia to help explore and settle Australia's vast and arid interior. So while the Ghans consisted mainly of Muslims from Afghanistan, a sizable number, as I told you, were Sikhs from Punjab. And the Ghans set up camel breeding stations. They set up rest house outposts known as Caravanserai throughout inland Australia. So creating a permanent link between coastal cities and the remote cattle and sheep grazing stations was their task until about 1930s, when they were largely replaced by automobiles, because automobiles came by that time. And India and Australia established diplomatic relations in the pre-independence period with the establishment of India Trade Office, which happened in Sydney in 1941. And the Australian government then supported the independence of India from the British Empire and the admission of India as a republic to the Commonwealth of Nations. Also, easing of restrictions in the post-war period contributed to the increase of Indian migrants to Australia. So in the 1980s, we see Indian engineers and IT experts, they had migrated from India for opportunities in the technology industry in Australia. In recent times, the large number of migrants from India has increased to about 700,000 in 2021, which is a huge number. The new wave of Indian migrants to Australia are highly educated. They are very well traveled, and of course, they've gelled very well into the local society. At the end of the Cold War, and simultaneously, India's decision to launch major economic reforms, which happened in 1991, provided the first positive move towards development of closer ties between India and Australia. Because before that, Australia was looking mainly towards the United Kingdom, towards Japan, United States, etc., for bilateral relationships, and especially the trade relationship. And then the trade and commercial links between the two nations began to develop, and this economic cooperation has continued to deepen since the turn of this century. With the passage of time, the relationship also gained momentum towards a strategic relationship along with the economic engagement. But this has not been without its hiccups. India was firmly opposed by Australia regarding the nuclear tests in 1998. Then, in the second decade of the 21st century, we saw a number of attacks in Australia against Indian students whose numbers were suddenly surging. And traditionally, Australian businesses have a very limited understanding of Indian companies and the business environment. And USA, Europe, Japan, South Korea, and China have been the preferred markets. But these perceptions have changed considerably over the past few years, and I would say over the last decade in particular. So it was in 2009 that India and Australia established a strategic partnership that included a joint declaration on security cooperation, which has further been elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership in 2020. The Australian Foreign Policy Blueprint, which was released in November 2017, sees India in the front ranks of Australia's international partnerships. And it actually says that beyond an increasingly important economic relationship, our security interests are congruent. They are particularly in relation to stability and openness in the Indian Ocean. And both countries have common interests in upholding international law, especially in relation to freedom of navigation and maritime security. Today, we find to be the principle of and the bedrock of this relationship. So the India-Australia bilateral relationship, if you take a stock of it, has undergone some very rapid evolution in recent years, developing largely along a positive track into a friendly partnership. Of course, the two countries have a lot in common, which is underpinned by a shared value of a pluralistic Westminster-style democracy, the Commonwealth of traditions, expansion of economic engagement, and increasing high-level interaction, which I'll talk about a little later. There are several commonalities. That includes a very strong and vibrant secular and multilateral democracy, a free press, independent judicial system, the English language, and these all serve as a foundation for closer cooperation and multifaceted interaction. Then there have been long standing people-to-people ties, which a little bit which I talked about to you, and also the increasing number of students which are coming to Australia for higher education, the growing tourism, the growing sporting links, especially cricket and hockey. So they've all played a very significant role in further strengthening this relationship. In recent years, the India-Australia relationship has charted a whole new trajectory of transformational growth. Bilateral cooperation has seen an exponential growth in existing frameworks of cooperation and further expanded across a wide spectrum of new areas, both at bilateral as well as the global level. Excuse me. So we've had now greater convergence of views on international issues, and that includes issues like international terrorism and also a shared approach to the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region, because there's a common threat faced by the two countries from a belligerent China, something which Professor Girish Kumar referred to. The two countries have expanded their bilateral relationship into global partnerships and plurilateral formats as well, and that includes the Quad grouping, which with Japan and the United States. And then there's been a resilient supply chains initiative between India, Australia, and Japan, and that has formally been launched in April of 2021. So we've had a number of high-level visits. In 2014, in fact, we had two prime ministerial visits. So first, we had a visit of then Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and then the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, visited Australia for the G20 Leaders Summit at Brisbane, and this was followed by a bilateral visit in November. That was a time when a framework of security cooperation between India and Australia was signed. Then, of course, we had a visit by Prime Minister Turnbull. This happened in 2017. Our own president was in Australia in 2018, and this was preceded by the visit of the Governor General of Australia, Sir Peter Cosgrove. Of course, Prime Minister Modi and Scott Morrison participated in an India-Australia Leaders Virtual Summit. This happened in June of 2020, very significant in the middle of the pandemic, because here it was here that the bilateral strategic partnership, which was concluded in 2009, was elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership. So, apart from a joint statement on the comprehensive strategic partnership, this summit also delivered 8 landmark agreements and MOUs. So that included maritime cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, defense, cybersecurity, education, mining, water resource management, etc. And in order to pursue this, both countries met in a 2+2 format biannually. Then we also had the Quad Summit, in which the two prime ministers participated. That happened in March 2021. And here the prime ministers of India, Australia, Japan, and the president of USA participated. So what has happened is that over the years, we've had an array of mechanisms which have been put in place to promote bilateral cooperation. I just wanted to elaborate on some of them. First is the Foreign Ministers Framework Dialogue, which is a central mechanism for advancing the bilateral agenda. This is held annually, very faithfully, and both sides are sticking to it. And secondly, we have the India-Australia Joint Ministerial Commission, which was established in '89, so that the government and business could talk on investment and trade-related issues. These meetings are also held quite regularly, and one very important visit was one by Suresh Prabhu when he was Commerce Minister. He visited Australia in 2018, and during the second leg of his visit, he addressed representatives of about 28 Australian super funds in Sydney in June 2018, and then that opened the way for Australian super funds to invest into Indian infrastructure projects. Australian Trade Minister Simon Birmingham came with a very large business delegation, about 150 odd people, in 2020 for the 16th round of the JMC. And that was another landmark visit, in my view, because that opened up Australian eyes to the possibilities of what existed in India. Uh, Thirdly, the Niti Aayog has a bilateral cooperation with the Australian Treasury, and this is called the Niti Aayog Economic Policy Dialogue, which has happened once in 2019. Fourthly, we have a civil nuclear cooperation agreement between the two countries, which is also very important. This agreement came into force in November 2015 because it was agreed to during the 2014 visit of the Prime Minister to Australia, and that provides a framework for substantial new trade in energy between Australia and India. And Australian Parliament had to pass a civil nuclear transfer to India bill in 2016, which ensures that uranium mining companies of Australia can fulfill their contracts to supply Australian uranium to India for civil use, with the confidence that exports would not be hindered by the domestic legal action challenging the consistency of the safeguards that are applied by IEA in India and Australia's international non-proliferation obligations. So Australia has a very strict non-proliferation law, as many of you would know. It also ensures that any future bilateral trade in other nuclear-related material or items for civil use will also be protected. Fifth is the extended defense cooperation, and this started in real earnest again in 2014 after the Prime Ministerial visit. So that covers now research, development, and industry engagement, and regular meetings are held at the level of defense ministers. Both sides now conduct regular maritime exercises, and also now there are service-to-service talks. There was a technical agreement on wide shipping information exchange, which happened in 2015. And after that, we've had a series of exercises like OS Index between the two countries. There's exercise Pitch Black, which happens off Australia. There's also a biennial exercise of the Australian Navy, which is Kakadu, in which many other countries participate. There's Ostra Hind, which is a Special Forces Army exercise. And of course, the Australia-India strategic engagement got enhanced when there was an arrangement concerning mutual logistics support and implementing agreement, which was signed in 2020. So now, of course, ships from both sides can visit each other regularly. They can refuel. They can get repair facilities, etc. So it's a far-reaching agreement, whose significance is yet to be seen, in my view, which will happen, I'm sure, in the future sometime. Then we have a very important Australia-India Strategic Research Fund. This was established in 2006, and it supports collaboration between scientists in India and Australia in cutting-edge research. It also consists of an Australia Biotechnology Fund, the Australia-India Sciences and Technology Fund, and the Grand Challenge Fund and Fellowship Scheme. So many students from India who go to IITs, for instance, have made use of this facility to further pursue their interests in Australia, to carry on research, etc. Now, both sides, of course, contribute equally to this fund. India is a very enthusiastic supporter of this fund because it supports large scale research projects which are designed to deliver some very practical solutions focused on energy, on focused on food and on water security, health and the environment. All these are so important today in India. And we have a joint committee on science and technology and biotechnology, which has been established to administer this fund. And then in the agriculture side, also there is a working group which meets regularly. There's a working group on water resources, which the last meeting of which was held in September of 2020. And there's a special COVID round which has happened under the Australia India Science and Technology Fund. So we've had projects on COVID-19 screening and diagnostic testing, cardiac markers. They were all announced in 2020 December. Um, Plus, there is an Australia-India security dialogue, energy security dialogue, and there's an MOU on cooperation in mining and processing of critical and strategic minerals. This was also concluded in 2020, and the first meeting of this joint working group has already been held in November of 2020. Many of you would know that Australia is also a founding member of both the International Solar Alliance as well as the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And Australia has supported India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative. It's a fully fledged partner in two programs. Eighth is the Joint Working Group on Education, and this should interest you because that has identified several key areas of cooperation, including collaborative research in education policy, student exchange programs, capacity building in vocational education, and distance learning in higher education. What India has been trying to do is to ensure that the skilling degrees, which are normally given in Australia, are imparted by these organizations in India itself, so that the people who undergo the skilling in India can then move on to jobs based on that certification. And also the joint working group meeting between India and Australia, which is between the Ministry of Skill Development and Entrepreneurship and the Australian Department of Education, Skills and Employment, was held just now in November 2020. So we are on track with all these programs. Very importantly, Australia's education minister was in India with a large delegation of senior leaders in November 2019, where he chaired the fifth Australia India Education Council. That's another body which helps in taking forward the education exchanges between India and Australia. Ninth, we've signed a very important MOU on tourism between the two countries, along with an MOU on sports. This happened with Prime Minister Turnbull was in India in 2017, and that has already shown a lot of results in terms of Australia helping out India in setting up sports universities and facilities, in sending coaches to India in particular, disciplines of sports, and the tourists from India to Australia increasing exponentially. Of course, during the pandemic years, we've had a problem because the flights could not take off. So we've had a lull. But just before that happened, we could see a massive surge in Australians receiving Indians in Australia in their tourist facilities. 10th is the field of culture, where we had done a festival called Confluence in Australia in 2016, and then a Conference 2 was held in 2017. Australia has returned a number of artifacts that were stolen from around the world and which happened to be in Australia. This includes a very important bronze idol of Nataraja from Art Gallery of South Australia, Natarajan stone structure in 2020, two Dwarpal stone sculptures also in the same museum. So all this has added to the goodwill between the two countries. Of course, they didn't have to do it, but they actually made sure that this is something which should be taken forward as a mark of the relationship which is evolving between the two countries. Very important agreements in the consular cooperation and mutual legal assistance have also been signed between the two countries. There's an extradition treaty which has been ratified by both governments, and there is a joint working group on visas and passports and consular matters, which also exists. There's a social security agreement which we don't have with so many countries around the world, which was signed in 2014. So those, Indians, for example, who work in Australia, can take advantage of the mobility which happens when you move from one country to another, so your contributions to your provident fund, etc., can be taken care of quite easily. 12th is the Indian community in Australia, which I wanted to talk about a little bit. As I said, this community has grown in importance and in size, and now it is about 700,000 people. India is one of the top sources of skilled immigrants to Australia. The number of Indian students before the pandemic was 105,000 students. Now, of course, it's come down to about 70,000 after the pandemic. And after England, India is the second largest migrant group in Australia in 2020. So this is saying something. The growing significance of the Indian community there is reflected in the large-scale celebration of Indian festivals, including in the Australian Parliament now for the past 3 or 4 years. And in all states and major cities, there are associations or organizations of Indians. There are also umbrella federations of Indian associations in these states and territories. There are also several ethnic publications, Indian language programs on radio, Indian language schools, Indian dance schools in all major cities. So there's a lot which has happened by way of the diaspora in Australia. Finally, I'll come to the most important part of this relationship, which is bilateral trade and investments. And of course, Professor Girish mentioned that India is the seventh largest trade partner. I have a little, dated figures where it says that India was the eighth largest trade partner, and this was 2019-20 figures, with trade in goods and services at 26.2 billion Australian dollars, representing 3% share of the total Australian trade in financial year 2019-20. But of course, our exports are less compared to the Australian exports to India. India mainly exports refined petroleum and medicaments, pearls and gems and jewelry, textiles, which are very, very popular in Australia, women's clothing in particular, and also some base metals, while India imports mainly commodities from Australia. So things like coal, copper ores and concentrates, natural gas, non-ferrous waste and scrap, and education related services, which are the most important now, especially the online services. Both sides have invested roughly around 10 billion US dollars into each other's economies. There is an India Australia CEO forum, which is a mechanism for business for both nations to engage directly in order to take this relationship forward. This was established in 2011 and then revitalized in 2014. So it has heads of Indian and Australian businesses from a broad range of sectors, including energy and resources and agribusiness, the financial sector, telecom, IT, education and pharmaceuticals, etc. But it has not met regularly, and that's one of the issues that both sides have to tackle. The last meeting of this group was, so for example, in 2019, 2018 actually, during the visit of President of India to Australia. So it should meet much more regularly. It should have a better composition, given the fact that the trade relationship is now so much more diversified. One important issue that I'll talk about now is that the Australian Liberal government under Prime Minister Morrison accepted an India Economic Strategy Report to 2035 report. This happened in November of 2018 when our president was visiting Australia. And after that, it is taking measures to refine the recommendation in the report in order to increase the Australian investment, which is, as I said, 10 billion US dollars to $100 billion by 2025, 2035, and to focus also on investments and engagement in 10 specific areas. So they've chosen the areas of education, tourism, resources, and agribusiness, etc., in 10 focus states in India. And when Prime Minister Modi was in Australia and later on met Scott Morrison on the sidelines of the East Asia Summit in Singapore in 2018, he conveyed that India will also reciprocate with a similar Australia-focused report from the Indian perspective. And so the Commerce Ministry and Minister were tasked to do this, and they asked me, along with CIA and KPMG, to undertake this report. Uh, and this was released by Minister Goyal in November of 2020. So this Australia Economic Strategy report has identified opportunities in 12 broad sectors of mining and resources, agribusiness, healthcare and pharmaceuticals, education and skills development, information technology, and some niche opportunities in some other sectors like renewable energy, tourism, financial services, some creative fields, infrastructure, space, and defense. And it also covers 8 emerging areas of cooperation like lithium-ion battery technology and resources, medical and water technologies, data analytics and cloud computing, space technology and manufacturing, which have relevance actually to the future aspirational plans of both the economies. And just to cite a few examples of areas which are touched upon by this report, Australia has large mining reserves and is one of the top 5 producers of 20 commodities, which includes iron ore, coal, lithium, cobalt, tungsten, rare earth minerals, graphite, copper, manganese, zinc, and gold. And currently, Australia produces 9 out of the 10 elements required to produce lithium ion batteries, all these anodes and cathodes, so it is very important. Also, India has to focus on Australia in order to meet its demand for minerals in the future. Australia has potash, phosphate deposits, and with the development of Ennore port, there's an opportunity which has arisen for India to ship LNG from Australia as well. Australia offers collaboration and investment opportunities in mining equipment and technology services, training for mine safety, and also exports of Indian mining and drilling equipment built to Australian specifications. And many companies from Australia have actually invested in India and are getting their own equipment made here and then shipped back to Australia to bring down the costs. Um, Again, Australian farm and dairy productivity is very high, and this is due to some innovative technologies and artificial intelligence. So there is a lot of research collaboration possibilities in cutting edge technologies with Australian universities and the use of space technologies to map crop and weather patterns. If that is done, then the two governments can largely benefit from this. Also, this report identifies acquisition of agro-tech companies by Indian companies in Australia in places there where there is water along with the land, because India keeps on importing cotton, walnuts, and almonds, and this can easily be invested into in Australia, so that we strengthen our food supply chain. We also need in India food processing and refrigerating techniques to prevent food wastage. So these are all very good opportunities for collaboration. We also see that in the field of education, joint PhD programs, dual degree programs, focus programs which are areas of need in both countries. And I'm talking of things like geology, museology, design, etc. Because a lot of these courses are not offered in many of our universities. These will all will actually ensure employability for Indian students. So we've recommended that in the report. And again, for skilling, as I mentioned earlier, we've looked for Australian skilling institutions, in particular those who can train the trainers and then carry on with these programs in India. In the field of health, there is a large possibility of collaboration in geriatric health, in collaboration in cancer research, medical technologies, data analysis for health insurance industry, and also standardization of registration procedures. There's an increasing Indian presence in Australia in Ayurvedic preparations, biosimilars, and generics in the Australian markets present huge opportunities as well. And of course, in information technology, India presents a great opportunity for Australian companies to set up their global innovation centers here. Cybersecurity needs can be met through Indians who are increasingly adept at this, and there is a huge talent pool available in India. Also, there is collaborative research in hydrogen as an alternative fuel, which can be undertaken, and sports technology and stadia and facility technologies, how to use our stadiums when they're not in season, for instance. All these can be learned from Australia. And finally, the Australian pension funds can build on the pleasant experience that they've had of Australian companies like Macquarie on the toll road space, which is increasing in India, in groundwater management and conservation, basin development. All these are areas where India can learn from Australia. Now, since this report was launched, India has undertaken a number of reforms, as we all know, in sectors which are of direct interest to Australia. First of all, there are after the Atmanirbhar Bharat mission was launched, India is now open for collaboration in things like mining, healthcare, and pharmaceuticals, in IT, infrastructure, and defense, space, agriculture, food processing, grain storage, dairy modernization, and all these Australian companies have particular strengths. Mining regulations have been eased in India to attract foreign investments in India, and Australia has announced substantial investments in cybersecurity. India has a large technology resource pool that is complementary to these Australian requirements. There is also now a very broad agreement, not only amongst the Quad countries, but also bilaterally between India and Australia to develop and to roll out vaccines, especially in the Indo-Pacific. A new education policy has been rolled out in India, which has opened up possibilities of collaboration of Australian universities with Indian universities. There is the PLI scheme, which has been launched in India, several areas of manufacturing where Australia has an interest. So all this has led to a situation where conditions are created once again for a bilateral CICA agreement between India and Australia. And so the agreement has been reached to have an early harvest agreement. Both the ministers have said that they would like to conclude this by the end of 2021, which seems to be slipping by about a month or so. And then by the end of 2022, they could perhaps sign a fully fledged agreement. Um, I think many of these areas can be taken from the areas identified in the Australia Economic Strategy report. And most importantly, I think what we need is that the Australian ambitions in the agriculture sector will have to be toned down. India needs Australian expertise and technology and innovation. So this is the area for our agriculture to be focused upon. And of course, India can show some flexibility in tariff lines related to commodities and minerals, which we in any case import from Australia. What India needs for its growing economy is the e-mobility, and its e-mobility program can also be factored into this agreement. We also export, as I said, railway vehicles and refined petroleum, gems and jewelry, auto components, made-up textile items. All these the tariffs can come down, which will give us a level playing field as far as the Australian market is concerned. So Australia will look definitely for India's national monetization plan pipeline, which has been launched by the government to monetize about $81 billion worth of brownfield assets. This, as you know, will happen over 2022 to 25. And for Australia, some of the important sectors are roads and railways, power and public warehouses, the civil aviation and port infrastructure, sports stadia, and the mining assets. There is this 2.3 trillion pension fund sector in Australia, which can become a regular source of investments in the India infrastructure and disinvestment story going forward over the next few years. And by the way, about 100 tariff lines cover more than 90% of India-Australia bilateral trade. So if we can bring down tariffs in these areas, in these commodities, that will benefit both countries. The Australia Economic Strategy Report has also recommended that we set up a startup fund between the two countries. We also put in more money into the Science and Technology Fund, and we start a humanities fund. So all this will open up a lot of avenues for education between the two countries. And of course, if we have more direct flights between the two countries, that would aid tourism and business both. So to conclude, I think India will have to strategically secure its resource requirements, which includes natural and mineral resources and food, etc. But it also needs to develop innovative technologies to make best use of these resources. And Australia is endowed with these natural resources. It has secured this on the basis of extensive research and development across various sectors that are of strategic importance to India. And therefore, Australia becomes a strategic partner for India as well as a source for technology upgradation. So I'll stop there and take questions. Thank you.